Hello, I'm Dennis, musician, audio engineer, and game audio sound designer. The purpose of this video is to shed a little insight on how you can build your own acoustic panels for your own studio for a fraction of the cost and increased effectiveness of commercial panels. Additionally, I'd like to encourage that you can build these panels with just a few simple tools, but if you have even better tools or access to them from a friend or family member, then it'll be even easier for you. First, let's go over the main essential materials. The frames are made from 1x3 pine boards, but note that the actual dimensions of these boards are 3/4 inch by 2.5 inches. Also note that the reason why I chose these dimensions of boards is because the acoustic material that I'm using is about the same thickness, so that they fit snugly between the frames. 8-foot lengths of these boards will run you about $5 a piece at Home Depot. That brings us to the acoustic material itself, which is Rockwool Safe and Sound. What I love about this material is that it is made from crushed stone and wool, so it is not only safe to handle, but also just to have around. Additionally, this material is actually known for being acoustically superior to conventional fiberglass insulation when being installed in a home. You can pick up a bundle of Rockwool for about $40 at Home Depot, and that pack will lightly cover enough panels for a whole room. One important thing I'll say with figuring out how much wood you'll need is to consider that each piece of Rockwool is about 16 inches wide and about 4 feet long. So plan the dimensions of your frames accordingly, including a little bit of compression on the Rockwool for snugness. For example, if you're making large panels, consider making them 4 feet tall and about 2.5 feet wide, and use 2 pieces of Rockwool side by side inside the frame. Or for long skinny panels or square panels, make them about 18 inches wide, including the width of the wood, and 4 feet tall or less. Additionally, don't forget to account for a couple of recessed cross pieces of wood in the back, both for keeping the Rockwool in, as well as having some place to mount your feet and hanging hardware. Now, the most fun part of making panels is picking out your covering material, which I usually shop for at a fabric store with lots of choices such as Joann. You can also get material at places like Walmart, etc., but they'll likely be limited on choices. For my panels, I like to use thick, off-white muslin because it keeps the room looking bright and clean. The main things to keep in mind are that darker material will darken the ambient light of your room. Also, materials with actual patterns may eventually clash with your room or feel too busy. And materials that are too thin will allow the Rockwool to show through, which has caused me to do second layers on panels where the muslin I bought was too thin. The main thing is to be sure and pay attention to the material dimensions so that they will at least be able to wrap around the back of the frames to be stapled top, bottom, and sides. Note that I have left the backs of most of my large panels uncovered so that I don't need to use so much fabric, but also because I believe the panels are actually just as effective that way, and the Rockwool is safe and has never fallen out on me. As far as cost goes on your covering material, Joann always seems to be having sales, often as much as 30% off, and it seems like the fabric, on average, is about $5 per yard. Lastly, we'll need some 2-inch drywall or decking screws to secure the frame boards, some staples for our staple gun to attach the covering materials on the back, some rubber feet to suspend the panels away from the wall, and some picture wire and picture hooks to hang the panels on the wall. All of these items are pretty minimal in cost. As far as tools go, a handsaw will work just fine for cutting these small 3-inch boards, which I've been using for lots of these panels. But if you have a miter saw at your disposal, then that's even easier. I will say that one thing about using a handsaw is that, although a little imperfect, it's good exercise and not so loud, which makes for a nice peaceful panel making day. Moving on, you'll need a drill because driving these screws by hand will just be brutal. And more importantly, we really should drill pilot holes before driving in our screws because this cheap, though effective, pine will split on you. I'm speaking from experience of being lazy here. Other than that, you'll need a tape measure and pencil, a staple gun. A small carpenter square is nice to make some straight lines for your cuts. And even better, a set of clamps really help with cutting and assembling, but not totally necessary. So for getting started, as they say, measure twice and cut once to save you another trip back to Home Depot for any mistake cuts, including on your fabric. If you're using a trusty handsaw, clamps will help with keeping the board steady for cutting. Do some dry fit layouts before you screw things together. Also, before you drive any screws, be sure and drill your pilot holes to prevent any wood splitting. Use a drill bit that's just a bit skinnier than the screws that you're using. One other tip on planning your cuts and screw points is to watch out for knots in the wood. Knots in the wood are generally okay in the middle of pieces, but when they're on the corners or screw points, those sections could fall apart on you. I've had to use duct tape on a couple of corners where I poorly planned with knots. It's a crude but effective fix as long as it doesn't show through on your material. If you have just one drill, which most of us do, it is a bit of a pain to swap out your drill bit for pilot holes and back to your Phillips bit for driving screws. But this is where the clamps come into play, where you can clamp the whole thing together, drill a bunch of pilot holes, and then do a bunch of screws all at once. I typically like to recess my cross braces inside the frames for sleekness, and with that method you'll find that the rock wool bulges up a bit across the braces. For that, I just compress the rock wool a little with my hands across that area. Setting the rock wool into the frames and prepping the covering material can be a little tricky, with flipping it over and stapling, etc. But I finally figured out a way around that recently where I set the rock wool into the frame, then laid the covering material over the top, placed a few spaced out staples on one side underneath, then pulled tight on the other side and placed a few more staples underneath until it was in place enough to flip it over and really go to work with tightening and stapling. Now, the corners are probably one of the more challenging aspects of building these panels, but if you've ever wrapped a gift before, you'll probably be okay. First, I suggest getting both of your sides tight, then move on to the ends. When stapling, always tighten and staple from the centers outward. Then when you get to the corners, play around a bit and you'll find you'll have a couple of options. But I recently discovered this technique where I pulled the triangle tight, then tuck in the excess and seal it in with the side piece. This is especially handy for creating extra wraparound with the larger panels that you aren't going to completely seal in the back. Onto the feet and picture wire. I actually like to do these at the same time, so that the excess wire gets kind of sealed inside of the rubber feet. What's nice about these rubber feet is that the screw recesses down just enough into the rubber not to mark the wall. Just be mindful not to drive the screw too much so that it tears completely through into the rubber. Also, regarding the necessity of using these rubber feet, instead of just hanging the panels flush with the wall, is that it almost doubles the effectiveness of the panels by suspending them away from the wall a bit. The rationale is that the sound hits the panels, passes through, then reflects off the wall, and gets reabsorbed by the panels again on the way back outward. If the panels were just flush with the wall, there would be more direct transmission between the panels and the wall. For hanging on the wall, use this method of pulling the wire tight with your tape measure to help figure out exactly what to add to your measurement of the top of the panel to the distance from the ceiling for the bottom of your picture hanger hook. Anyway, I like to close by saying this is just one method that I basically figured out for myself and has proven effective for my studio spaces as well as a few friends. I also wanted to say that I wish you the best of luck on building your own panels, but you don't need luck, you just need a little encouragement to try it for yourself, as well as a little patience and practice along the way.